During 1990, Miami's construction industry represented a fortune-making opportunity for some while creating devastation for others. $2 million evaporated through a complex web of false land transactions, and the married duo orchestrating it appeared to have completely vanished. For multiple decades, the investigation remained dormant, stored within neglected filing systems. Then, during 2021, one satellite photograph uncovered something extraordinary: a massive residential complex missing from every official database, masked behind intricate corporate ownership layers. What remained unknown then was that tracing its genuine owner would revive one of Miami's most puzzling financial fraud investigations. Throughout early 1990, Miami vibrated with the intensity of an expanding development sector. The urban landscape ascended higher each month, and the city's borders experienced change at an almost extraordinary speed. In zones that had represented vacant terrain just months earlier, building foundations were being established for housing communities, corporate parks, and vast shopping complexes. Area newspapers packed their real estate pages with dramatic headlines promising swift returns, while broadcast commercials encouraged viewers to invest immediately before costs tripled. The environment embodied optimism, financial speculation, and the certainty that anyone could achieve wealth through acquiring the appropriate land piece. In this dynamic setting, Terrence and Yvette Johnson represented the archetypal business-oriented partnership that comprehended opportunity exploitation. Terrence displayed effortless appeal, the variety that could immediately eliminate suspicion and convert curiosity into belief. He expressed himself with certainty, constructing tales of market development and promised value growth. Yvette worked with understated competence in the background, handling documentation, creating agreements, and providing neat, authoritative-looking materials at exactly the proper time to calm nervous investors. Together, they embodied the impression of reliability. They founded a land sales enterprise with Florida's government and secured a compact yet professional office in Miami's financial district. To potential clients, their business seemed legitimate from every viewpoint. They acquired classified promotions in established publications, contracted a photographer to record overhead perspectives of construction zones, and developed sophisticated brochures showcasing pictures of groomed streets and design images of future residential developments. The promotional language was designed to stimulate urgency. Terms like exclusive possibility and limited supply were matched with elegant imagery of proposed neighborhoods. When prospective investors visited, they faced a presentation that seemed both expert and thorough. The office walls featured expanded property charts with colored sections designated as purchasable. Upon the conference surface, there existed prototype lots and published planning documents showing parks, schools, and retail centers that were currently under approval procedures. Terrence discussed premium sites and upcoming infrastructure. Yvette delivered ready-to-execute purchase contracts cleanly assembled with payment guidelines and title copies that displayed seals and signatures virtually identical to those created by the county clerk's office. For those requiring additional assurance, she presented certified-style land evaluations and construction authorizations that appeared legitimate in every characteristic. But all elements were fake. Many lots they marketed either were owned by current holders or had never been partitioned into the sections shown in the documentation. The official stamps were fraudulent. The signatures were fabricated to replicate those of actual government officials. Some property charts were incomplete replicas from expired files, hand-modified to generate fictional properties. The entire enterprise was an elaborate fraud designed to last just long enough to accumulate significant financial sums. Within the first half year alone, the Johnsons managed to market these fictional parcels to numerous investors, accumulating roughly $2 million. The funds came through certified checks, bank transfers, and sometimes cash, all placed into the firm's central account. From there, the money was quickly split into various transfers, some sent to other American banks under corporate identities, others transported overseas. This complexity made following the money extremely difficult. By mid-1990, early warning signs appeared. Investors who expected to obtain official property titles encountered unexplained delays. Weeks became months, and inquiries about development progress received unclear responses about regulatory complications. In truth, no construction was intended, and no permits were authentic. Complaints started arriving at Miami police. When detectives reached the company's registered office, They found an abandoned location. The furniture had vanished, phone lines disconnected, and the leftover files were meaningless, packages of false documents with no legitimate legal value. The path to the Johnsons was already fading. Police questioned several people who had worked as the couple's marketing agents. These representatives claimed they were unaware of the deception. They had also received convincing materials, been trained to present them to clients, and received payments for each sale. From their perspective, they had been genuine employees of a genuine company. Detectives examined several theories. One investigation line suggested possible involvement of corrupt officials within the county property registration system. Some witness accounts implied that official stamps and signatures had been validated through channels that would have required internal access. However, without concrete evidence of bribery or cooperation, this theory failed to develop. The financial investigation revealed a partial trail pointing to Mexico. Certain bank movements from the company's accounts had been sent to Mexican institutions, and flight records indicated airline tickets bought in Terrence and Yvette Johnson's names for trips to Mexico City. Yet, immigration records showed they had never actually entered the country. It became increasingly obvious that these moves were intentional misdirection meant to convince investigators that the couple had fled internationally. By late 1991, the case had lost energy. With no confirmed location for the suspects, no new leads, and limited authority to pursue evidence abroad, investigators hit a dead end. In 1992, the case was officially closed and marked as unsolved. The files were moved to long-term storage, their importance seemingly finished. In the end, the Johnsons had managed to disappear, not just physically, but legally. Without extradition treaties to use, and with no active sightings, law enforcement had little hope of recovery. The stolen funds remained untracked, spread across unknown accounts, and converted into assets that would be nearly impossible to identify without new evidence. The file joined thousands of other inactive cases in the archives, labeled, dated, and stored. For the victims, it was a bitter ending without compensation, without arrests, and without the satisfaction of seeing those responsible face justice. By 2021, Miami had changed beyond recognition. Where empty lots once stretched to the horizon in the early 1990s, there were now crowded neighborhoods, landscaped parks, and sprawling commercial centers. The once semi-rural area of Palmetto Bay had transformed into an exclusive residential zone defined by gated communities, tree-lined streets, and properties worth millions. Development there was strictly regulated. New construction required permits, inspections, and complete registration in public land records. Within weeks of construction start, projects appeared on county property maps and tax rolls, the details filed in the public database of the Miami-Dade property appraiser. Jamal Harris, a 38-year-old spatial data analyst, had worked for years at a private firm contracted to help municipalities with urban monitoring. His responsibilities were systematic and data-focused. Cross-checked the latest satellite and aerial imagery against official parcel maps to spot discrepancies. In most cases, the mismatches he found were routine: delays in updating databases, minor surveying errors, or regular renovations that had yet to be logged. That day, however, Harris encountered something far from routine. On a high-resolution satellite image captured only weeks earlier, he noticed a property at the corner of a quiet residential street. It was no ordinary home. The image revealed a massive 3-story mansion complete with a covered swimming pool, a tennis court, landscaped gardens, and a large ornamental fountain. The property was enclosed by a tall, continuous fence and sat on nearly a hectare of land. Mature trees shaded the perimeter, and the lawn showed clear evidence of ongoing maintenance. The scene suggested long-term occupancy, not recent construction. Yet, according to the official county property map, the lot was listed as vacant. Harris began his verification process. First, he accessed the parcel's historical records in the Public Property Appraiser database. The last registered improvement dated back to the early 1990s, a modest single-story home built in 1968. There was no record of demolition, no permit applications for new construction, and no inspections logged in county archives. The property's taxable value had been calculated for decades as though it were still an unimproved lot with an outdated small home. He reviewed aerial imagery archives spanning 1995 to 2020. The anomaly deepened. Every image from the mid-1990s onward showed the same large mansion in place, unchanged in footprint. That meant the structure had stood for more than 25 years without ever being acknowledged in county records. Harris moved on to tax payment records. Annual property taxes were being paid consistently, but not by an individual. The payer was a Florida-registered LLC with an unremarkable generic name. In its annual filings, the LLC listed ownership by a Delaware corporation, which in turn was controlled by an offshore entity registered in the British Virgin Islands. For a professional accustomed to spotting patterns, the layered corporate chain was an immediate red flag. Such arrangements were common for asset shielding and high-value real estate transactions, but they were also a hallmark of schemes designed to obscure ownership, evade taxes, or launder funds. In Miami's luxury property sector, shell corporations were not unusual, but even then, the physical structures were generally recorded in the property rolls. Here there was an active effort, it seemed, to make the building itself invisible to official data. Harris ruled out a mapping glitch by requesting a cadastral survey overlay from the cartography department. The discrepancy was absolute. On paper, an empty lot. In reality, a fully developed estate with utility connections clearly visible in the imagery. The presence of power lines, water service, and sewage connections indicated long-standing agreements with utility providers. Yet none of those services had triggered updates to property records. Ordinarily, such a discovery would be passed directly to the municipal planning department for review. This case, however, was far from ordinary. Harris assembled a comprehensive report that included satellite images spanning decades, tax payment histories, and a diagram of the ownership chain from Florida to the Caribbean. His supervisors reviewed it and, recognizing its potential legal implications, bypassed standard channels. The file was sent directly to the Miami-Dade Property Appraiser's investigative division. Within 48 hours, feedback confirmed Harris's suspicions. The property was absent from all official construction and improvement records. Its taxable value had never been adjusted to account for the mansion, resulting in decades of significant underpayment. The absence of permits suggested either deliberate concealment or a calculated exploitation of bureaucratic gaps. The property appraiser's office escalated the matter to the Miami Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit. Investigators there immediately saw the hallmarks of deliberate concealment. The combination of a hidden structure, corporate layering across multiple jurisdictions, and uninterrupted occupancy pointed toward something more than simple tax evasion. Investigators began by tracing the tax payment trail. All bills were settled by the Florida LLC using a corporate bank account opened under the name of a nominee director. Utility accounts, electricity, water, gas, were also in the LLC's name. Payments were regular, precise, and devoid of personal identifiers that could link them to an individual. Simultaneously, forensic analysts began reviewing historical economic crime cases involving real estate. The aim was to identify any instance where similar corporate structures had been used in connection with fraud. Normally, such cross-referencing would require weeks of database queries, but an early lead emerged almost immediately. One senior analyst noted that payment flows into the LLC's accounts during the mid-1990s mirrored deposits and transfers recorded in an unsolved 1990 Miami land fraud case. The figures matched in amount, date ranges, and even in the pattern of subsequent withdrawals to offshore accounts. That 1990 case involved a husband and wife team who had defrauded investors out of $2 million in phantom land sales before disappearing entirely. Their names, Terrence and Yvette Johnson. The case had been closed in 1992, marked inactive after all leads were exhausted. The resemblance in financial activity was compelling, though not yet definitive. Still, it justified a deeper financial probe. The state attorney's office authorized the engagement of a forensic accountant under contract, along with an in-house prosecutorial investigator to examine the money trail in detail. Their mission was clear: determine whether the funds used to acquire and maintain the Palmetto Bay estate could be tied directly to the stolen money from 1990. For Jamal Harris, the discovery ended with the report's submission. For the investigators now taking over, it was only the beginning. The file on the Johnson case had sat untouched in the Miami Police Department archives for nearly 3 decades. But in early 2021, the box was carried upstairs and placed on the desk of investigators in the Economic Crimes Unit. What prompted its return was not a random decision, but a direct lead. A property in Palmetto Bay whose ownership structure and payment history echoed transactions from the early 1990s. The first step was to extract the original financial documentation compiled between 1990 and 1992. Inside were detailed bank statements from the Johnsons' real estate company, photocopies of wire transfer orders, and summaries of deposits and withdrawals from accounts that no longer existed. Back in the early 90s, tracing international funds had been a slow, unreliable process. Requests to foreign banks were sent by fax or mail. Responses, if they came at all, arrived months later, and some jurisdictions ignored them entirely. Offshore secrecy laws had shielded owners behind numbered accounts and shell corporations. In 2021, those limitations were gone. Advances in financial forensics meant that decades-old paper records could be digitized, cross-referenced, and run through analytic software capable of identifying patterns invisible to human review. Investigators scanned the 1990s ledgers into a forensic accounting program, flagging every transaction over a certain threshold. Within days, the system produced a match. Several wire transfers in the Johnson file used the same intermediary banks, the same amounts, and on the same dates as payments logged in the ownership history of the Palmetto Bay estate. This correlation didn't prove ownership, but it established a crucial link. One entity in the modern property chain, a British Virgin Islands offshore company, had been named in background materials from the 1990 land fraud case. That alone justified reopening the investigation in full. The state attorney's office authorized an expanded inquiry. They brought in a contracted forensic accountant with experience untangling complex cross-border transactions, working alongside an in-house investigator from the prosecutor's office who specialized in cold cases involving real estate. Their objective was clear: reconstruct the flow of funds from the offshore accounts to the Florida property and identify the individuals behind them. The team began mapping the sequence of movements. In 1990, the Johnsons collected approximately $2 million from investors through their fraudulent land sales. Those funds were rapidly transferred to multiple offshore accounts. In 1993, a portion of the money re-entered the United States disguised as foreign investment capital from the BVY-registered company. That capital was funneled into a Florida LLC, which used it to purchase the Palmetto Bay lot. By 1995, construction of the estate was underway. From that point forward, every property tax payment and utility bill was covered by corporate accounts with no personal names attached. While the accountants traced the money, the investigative team turned to the Florida Department of Highway Safety and Motor Vehicles. Anyone living in the house over the years might have used the address for driver's license renewals, vehicle registrations, or insurance records. The search returned a critical result. In 2018, a woman named Shanice Williams had renewed her driver's license listing the Palmetto Bay address. A comparison of her DMV photograph to archived images of Yvette Johnson revealed a striking match. Facial structure, brow line, and the set of the eyes were nearly identical. Further checks uncovered another name tied to the property. From the early 2000s until 2015, a man named Marcus Williams had used the same address in DMV and insurance records. His image bore an equally strong resemblance to Terrence Johnson, aged by years and graying at the temples. The match was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. The investigators then pulled State Department of Health records, confirming that Marcus Williams, real name Terrence Johnson, had died in 2015 of natural causes. The death certificate bore only the assumed identity, which explained why no law enforcement alerts had been triggered at the time. Yvette, however, was still alive. DMV logs showed she had updated her driver's license in 2018 with the same Palmetto Bay address, placing her in the house well into the current decade. This narrowed the investigation's focus. She was the likely surviving owner and possibly the last link to the stolen funds. To solidify their case, the forensic accountant combed through decades of bank activity. The goal was to find documents showing that the funds used to buy the lot and build the estate came directly from accounts identified in the 1990 fraud. Parallel requests went out to utility companies. Billing histories for electricity, water, and natural gas confirmed uninterrupted occupancy of the residence from the mid-1990s to the present. All billed to the Florida LLC. Payments were drawn from a single commercial account, yet another indication of deliberate concealment. Before the team could quietly advance to the next step, word of the investigation leaked. The Miami Herald published an article about the invisible mansion of Palmetto Bay, noting that it might be connected to one of the city's largest unsolved fraud cases. The story spread rapidly through local media and online forums, attracting tips from anonymous callers. Some claim to have known the Johnsons personally in the 1980s and early 1990s, describing them as skilled at moving money offshore and creating impenetrable corporate veils long before their disappearance. For investigators, the publicity was a double-edged sword. The influx of tips provided new leads and background information, but the media exposure risked alerting Yvette to the fact that law enforcement was closing in. In response, the prosecutor's office accelerated preparations for a search warrant, determined to act before any evidence could be destroyed or moved. By this stage, the investigative file contained a series of compelling elements: confirmed identities of both Johnsons under assumed names, photographic matches from DMV records, a reconstructed financial trail linking offshore accounts to the property, consistent utility records proving long-term occupancy, and transactional overlaps with the original fraud case. Each piece reinforced the theory that the Palmetto Bay estate had been funded and maintained with stolen investor money. The case was no longer about a suspicious house. It was about the return of fugitives thought to have vanished 3 decades earlier. The next step was clear: secure legal authority to enter the estate and search for hard evidence tying it directly to the proceeds of the 1990 scam. The window of opportunity was narrowing, and the investigative team knew they had to move before it closed entirely. By the time the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office moved to secure a federal search warrant for the mansion in Palmetto Bay, the investigation had already transformed from a detached review of suspicious real estate into a direct mission to expose 2 fugitives who had eluded the law for over 30 years. The evidence trail was no longer a scattered collection of anomalies. It was a structured chain that investigators could follow from the fraud in 1990 straight to the present-day property. At its base was a Florida-registered LLC that legally held the title to the land. Above it sat a Delaware corporation, and beyond that an offshore entity in the British Virgin Islands. This layering of ownership had been a common tactic in the early 1990s for concealing the true identity of asset holders, and the names of these entities were already documented in the original Johnson case file from decades earlier. The forensic accountant brought in under contract by the state attorney's office had spent weeks digging through archival bank records, reconstructing the movement of funds with a level of precision that had been impossible in the 1990s. He matched historical payment slips from the original fraud to bank transaction logs preserved in institutional archives, finding undeniable overlaps. The money that funded the LLC's purchase of the Palmetto Bay lot had come directly from the same offshore account that received investor payments during the Johnsons' land scheme. The correlation went beyond general patterns. Specific transaction amounts and exact dates aligned perfectly, in some cases down to the day, leaving little room for coincidence. While the accountant traced the money, the state attorney's investigator was verifying occupancy patterns through DMV records and utility histories. The findings were consistent. The mansion had been continuously lived in since the mid-1990s, with electricity, water, and gas bills all paid from the same corporate accounts linked to the LLC payment records showed no lapses or irregularities, eliminating the possibility that the house was vacant, abandoned, or merely a paper asset. The real breakthrough came when archived DMV entries from 2018 revealed that a woman named Shanice Williams had used the mansion's address. Her driver's license photo, when compared to archived images of Yvette Johnson from the early 1990s, revealed an unmistakable match: the same facial structure, identical eye contours, and a subtle lift of the right eyebrow, a detail visible in the older photographs as well. A deeper dive into DMV history showed that prior to 2015, the same address had been linked to a man named Marcus Williams. His license photo, aged by decades, showed the same bone structure, frame, and facial lines as Terrence Johnson. His hair had grayed and his face had weathered, but the resemblance was undeniable. Confirmation from the Department of Health established that Marcus Williams had died in 2015 of natural causes, with the death certificate bearing only the assumed name. This explained why Terrence Johnson's fugitive status had not intersected with any official death record. With Terrence gone, the evidence pointed to Yvette living under her alias as the sole occupant and continuing beneficiary of the assets the couple had secured through fraud. The prosecutorial team compiled every element they had into a comprehensive case file. Photographic evidence from DMV archives established the true identities of both individuals. Banking records mapped the direct flow of illicit funds from the original scam into the property purchase. Corporate filings documented the ownership chain. Utility payment histories confirmed long-term residence. Taken together, these formed a complete, coherent narrative linking the 1990 crime to the present-day mansion. The federal judge reviewing the warrant application saw the combined weight of financial records, identity matches, and continuous occupancy and authorized the search. The plan was executed with precision. At dawn, law enforcement quietly sealed off the surrounding streets. The search team, composed of state attorney investigators, economic crimes detectives, and forensic technicians, entered the property with the warrant in hand. Inside, Yvette was found in the living room. She was informed of the legal process and placed under observation while the search commenced. Investigators moved systematically through the house, photographing each room and documenting the location of any physical evidence. On the second floor, in a private office, they forced open a locked mahogany desk. Inside were neatly organized files, deeds, tax statements, and correspondence related to the Palmetto Bay lot. Many of the documents dated to the mid-1990s, precisely when the property was acquired and the mansion constructed. In the basement, the team located a heavy steel safe with a combination lock. Once opened, it revealed bundles of U.S. currency still wrapped in original bank straps. The serial number ranges printed on the straps matched records from the 1990 fraud investigation, proving beyond doubt that the cash was part of the stolen investor funds. Alongside the money were several external hard drives and older laptop computers. Forensic examination on site confirmed the presence of scanned fraudulent land deeds and cadastral maps identical to those used by the Johnsons in their original scheme. These discoveries elevated the case from a circumstantial link to irrefutable proof. The physical cash directly tied the property to the proceeds of the 1990 fraud, and the digital archives preserved the operational tools of the original scam. For prosecutors, this meant the ability to charge Yvette not only with money laundering and tax evasion, but also to reopen the decades-old fraud case under the continuing offense doctrine, effectively bypassing the statute of limitations. By the end of the operation, every piece of evidence was logged and removed under strict chain of custody procedures. The team left the property knowing they now possessed a complete and airtight foundation for arrest and prosecution. What remained uncertain was whether Yvette, given her history of vanishing without a trace, would still be within reach when they moved to take her into custody. The search inside the Palmetto Bay mansion marked a decisive turning point in the investigation. The documents retrieved from locked drawers and the faded bank wrappers pulled from the safe did more than prove a connection between the property and the stolen funds. They offered a framework to reconstruct the mechanics of the original fraud almost month by month. Every file, receipt, and transfer record became a puzzle piece in a decades-long scheme that had been hidden in plain sight. The forensic accountant contracted by the prosecutor's office began his work in coordination with the Financial Crimes Analysis Unit. The initial focus was to align the transactions recorded in the physical folders and on the recovered hard drives with archived banking statements from the early 1990s. The matches were striking. In July of 1990, within days of the Johnsons' disappearance from Miami, the account belonging to their shell corporation initiated a sequence of large transfers to an offshore institution in Nassau. The amounts and dates lined up exactly with flagged transfers from the original case file, which had sat dormant in the police archives for nearly 30 years. These offshore deposits rested untouched until late 1992, when the funds were quietly repatriated to the United States, disguised as foreign investment into what was described in paperwork as a private residential development. Those returning funds landed directly in the account of a Florida-registered LLC controlled by a nominee owner. Within a month, that LLC closed on the purchase of the Palmetto Bay lot, a prime piece of real estate that was officially classified at the time as undeveloped land. There were no building permits associated with the property, no variance applications, and no inspections recorded in county files. Yet, the construction records found in the mansion revealed that by early 1995, work crews were on-site laying foundations and erecting the main structure of a three-story residence complete with luxury amenities. The construction itself had been layered with concealment. The work was carried out by a series of subcontractors, many of whom had been hired through another intermediary company, itself a paper entity designed to obscure the identity of the true client. Payments were routed through multiple accounts, with each layer intended to separate the paper trail from the Johnson's stolen capital. Any contractor who might have asked questions saw only the name of a legitimate Florida LLC on their checks, never the individuals behind it. One of the most effective elements in hiding ownership was the use of a Florida land trust established under Statute 689.071. In such trusts, the trustee's name appears on the property title while the actual beneficiary's identity is shielded from public records. The trustee in this case was a nominal figure, a local man who, for a flat annual fee, signed all documents without inquiry into their contents. His involvement kept the Johnsons' names or any of their known aliases far from any registry that an investigator in the 1990s could have accessed. The utility bills discovered during the search provided an unbroken chain of occupancy. Electric, water, and gas services had been billed to the same LLC from the day of connection, and all payments were made from a single corporate account at a Florida bank. The consistency of these payments, never late, never interrupted, reinforced the conclusion that the residence had been continuously occupied, even as it remained officially non-existent in tax and property databases. Because property taxes were assessed only on the land value, calculated as if the lot were still a bare plot, the annual obligation remained a fraction of what it should have been. Over the span of more than 2 decades, this resulted in hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes, savings that were, in reality, part of the ongoing fraud. As the prosecutor's team overlaid these findings onto a comprehensive timeline, the narrative solidified. In 1990, $2 million were extracted from investors through the sale of non-existent land parcels. The funds were quickly pushed offshore, cycled through jurisdictions to erase their origin, and then returned under the guise of legitimate investment. The Palmetto Bay property was acquired and developed without the county ever registering the new structure. The residents stood, lived in, and maintained, but invisible to the systems designed to record and regulate such assets. Any surplus from the original stolen capital had been funneled into additional ventures, themselves masked by similar shell entities, creating a network of assets that could operate indefinitely beyond the reach of standard oversight. For investigators, this reconstructed chain of events was more than a historical account. It was a legal lifeline. Because the stolen money had been actively laundered and reinvested well beyond the 1990s, the criminal conduct could be framed as an ongoing offense. This designation was critical, as it circumvented the statute of limitations that would otherwise have barred prosecution for the original fraud. Now the charges could be expanded to include money laundering, wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy, all supported by fresh evidence that tied the acts directly to assets still in the defendant's possession. After the search of the Palmetto Bay mansion concluded and the forensic analysis of the evidence was complete, the Miami-Dade prosecutor's office moved quickly to formalize charges. The indictment they prepared drew on 3 core criminal counts: large-scale fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Every component of the case had been methodically built over months of investigation, from the digital trails and corporate records to the physical cash wrappers recovered from the safe. The narrative the prosecutors presented to the federal grand jury was comprehensive, interlocking old evidence with the newly uncovered proof in a way that left little room for alternative explanations. Jurors were shown the transaction histories tracing the stolen capital across decades, the photographic matches from DMV archives confirming identity changes, and the records proving uninterrupted occupancy of the hidden mansion. The grand jury's decision was swift. With the chain of custody intact and corroboration from multiple sources, they voted unanimously to authorize a federal arrest warrant for Yvette Johnson, who had been living under the name Shanice Williams. Once the warrant was issued, the operation to take her into custody was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, early in the day to reduce the chances of her being away, and to ensure the tactical team could secure the property before word spread. When the convoy arrived and the perimeter was established, the stillness of the property was the first sign that something was wrong. The blinds were drawn, the driveway empty, and there were no signs of movement inside. The team breached the front door, moving through the familiar rooms documented during the search weeks earlier, but each one was vacant. Wardrobes were partially emptied, and drawers that had once been neatly organized now contained only stray items. The kitchen counters were bare. It became clear within minutes that Yvette had left. Neighbors approached discreetly for information, recalled seeing her 2 days earlier loading several large suitcases into a black SUV. Flight records confirmed the next piece. Under her assumed identity, a ticket had been purchased to Panama City the same afternoon. Panama's position as a gateway to much of Central and South America meant she could have moved on within hours to a jurisdiction where U.S. law enforcement would have little practical reach. The search of her home weeks earlier had already signaled that the investigation was active and closing in. Whether she had been tipped off about an imminent arrest through a contact or had simply read the signs from the aggressive nature of the search, she understood that staying meant risking immediate detention. For someone with decades of experience in avoiding law enforcement, the decision to disappear again was almost instinctive. The property itself was immediately seized under civil forfeiture statutes as an asset acquired with criminal proceeds. The legal process moved faster than the criminal trial would have, resulting in the mansion's listing for auction within months. Bidders came from across Florida, attracted by both the location and the notoriety of the case. When the sale concluded, the proceeds were directed into a restitution fund for surviving victims of the 1990 scheme. Although the amount recovered was substantial, it covered only a fraction of the original losses. Much of the stolen fortune remained locked away in offshore accounts registered to entities still beyond the reach of American subpoenas, their control now likely transferred to intermediaries or concealed within new layers of ownership. Within the prosecutor's office, the case was filed as both a success and a cautionary tale. It demonstrated the capacity of modern investigative tools, satellite imagery, utility billing analysis, financial forensics, cross-referenced identification databases, to pierce through decades of concealment. Yet it also showed that even airtight evidence could not guarantee a suspect's presence at the moment of arrest. For the victims, the resolution was bittersweet. Many of those who had been defrauded 3 decades earlier were no longer alive to see the outcome. Those who remained received partial compensation, but were acutely aware that the woman responsible had once again evaded direct accountability. Officially, the file could be closed once the property was liquidated and the restitution distributed, but the absence of a defendant in the courtroom left the ending feeling incomplete. As for Yvette Johnson, her whereabouts became the subject of speculation. Intelligence briefings suggested she might have traveled through multiple transit points after Panama, possibly changing her identity again and settling in a location with limited extradition agreements. In professional circles, the belief was that she had the resources and network to rebuild a comfortable life elsewhere, perhaps in another opulent property just as carefully shielded from public records as the mansion in Palmetto Bay.